today we're building a plot grid. This has been highly requested by many of you in many videos. You want to see how I make my plot grid. So here I am, and I'm going to show you exactly how I do it. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie, and I am writing 2 books, and I just finished the 4th draft of Project Lily, and now I am ready to start plotting my 2nd book, which is unnamed at the moment. And that means it's time to set up a plot grid so I can start plotting. A plot grid is essentially laying out your entire story in a grid. The first column is every single chapter, and then every column thereafter are various things in your book, and you put each thing that happens in every chapter in the associated column. Don't worry about trying to imagine it because I will be showing you. I have found plot grids to be the most effective outlining method for myself. It allows me to visually see what's going on in the story, and I can move things around really easily because I do it in Excel. It allows me to see where there are gaps in the story and where I might have pacing issues. I'm really excited to take this next step into working on my book, so let me show you how I make my plot grid. I make my plot grid in Excel. You're free to use whatever spreadsheet software you want to use, but Excel really gives you that grid visualization. You can also do it on paper if you want. So the first thing you have to do is put in the chapters. And I like to put in 40 chapters just because in my experience, that's about how long my books are. And 40 chapters is a good estimate to work from. Obviously, it could be 35, it could be 50, who knows, but it's a good place to start. The next 2 columns I do is the timing and the month. Let me fix that timing. Now, timing is how long is it between each chapter. So obviously the first chapter would be start. The next chapter might be a week later. And I go through each chapter and plan out how long it is in between each one. This helps me look at pacing primarily, and then it also helps me calculate the month. So we'll just say this starts in September. And then you can go through with your timing and then calculate out what month it's going to be. Now, I write a fantasy novel, and I don't have the typical months in my novel. Like, my characters aren't walking around in September. Primarily, this is for the seasonal aspect of it. What are the characters wearing? Are they hot? Are they cold? What activities are they doing because of the weather? How should I describe the environment? That's what the month really helps me do, is get into the environment of my novel and understand how I need to write it. It also helps me look at the timing of my novel and see, is too much stuff crowded around a particular point in time, or has too much time passed? So these 2 things are really helpful for me in terms of gauging my pacing throughout the novel. The next column I do is setting. And this is pretty self-explanatory. I like to put 4 things in my setting. I'll put the country or kingdom, however you want to do it. I put the city, I put the building they're in, and then I put the room. The setting really helps me because I personally think of my novel in terms of where things occurred. So I know characters had a conversation in this room. And so when I'm trying to find that conversation in a particular chapter in my novel, I can honestly search by setting and find it really easily. The next thing I put down is the plot, because that is what we're trying to do here. And then I also type next to the plot the main plot, and I put the 3 words, 4 words of whatever that is. It could be win the trial, it could be complete a heist, anything like that. It helps me remember as I do this what the main point of the whole story is. And I just go through each chapter and I type in everything that's happening associated to the main plot, everything that's driving the story. And this is going to be, quite honestly, the largest column out of everything in this plot grid. I do put bits and pieces of other columns into this column just to keep track of anything. But to me, column E is really the driver of this entire plot grid. Next, I have main characters. So I write books typically with female main characters. You could do male main characters, whatever you want. So I have the FMC, the MMC, and other main characters. And I like to have them up front because they're typically the ones involved in every chapter. and they're the ones interacting with each other. And I like having them all together just so I can see how all that interaction plays out. Also, what I put in this column is more than just what they are doing in the scene. This does include their physical actions, but it also includes what are they thinking and what are they feeling. I like to track these things because I think it's really helpful to track the character arc. I go into a story knowing what is the character's internal journey, and this helps me keep track of that and see if there's any pacing issues or any areas where I might need improvement. The next columns I do are relationship columns. So the first one is the romantic relationship, and the next one I will do is a platonic relationship. It is really hard to type and talk at the same time. I'm going to scroll this over. This will look better. I zoomed this in a lot so you could see it better. With the romantic relationship, this is obviously how these two characters interact with each other, the progression of their relationship. This is also a really important column, especially if you're writing a romance novel or a romantasy or a fantasy romance even. This is a very, very useful column to see how just the romance itself plays out through the book. And the next column is platonic relationships. And with platonic relationships, I have found this column very important as well. I like to use this to track sibling relationships and friend relationships. I don't do it with every single person in the novel. I just do it with like the main 2 or 3 relationships. It really helps me track if there's a falling out, how that happens, and then how the 2 characters end up making up. It can also just track like how do 2 people become friends over time. And then after those main relationships, I start doing side characters. So I will call it side character 1, side character 2, side character 3. Now, I don't put every side character, but I like to put the side characters that either pop up frequently throughout the novel, or maybe in my head, they might have a bigger role to play in the second novel if this is a series. And this is just kind of the same things as the main characters, tracking their movements, tracking what they're thinking and feeling, and also tracking how their relationship develops with the other characters. Next, I'm going to put other kind of random plot points that occur throughout the novel. So one thing I always put, because I write fantasy novels, is magic. I use this column to track when I drop information about magic, when certain magic comes to light. Not only does this help in terms of pacing, but this kind of thing also helps with any Easter eggs I may want to drop in. I can see possibly where I want to do that. I think it's really important to track the magic in a fantasy novel because this is where you can really see if you do info dumping, and this helps me prevent that. Another plot point I will do is history. Oops, I spelled it wrong. History. This is the political. Is there anything political going on? Are there any like society things that happened? I use this column just to track all that, again, to avoid info dumping, and then also to make sure I've captured all the little details that I want to capture. And this is also where I will put any subplots. So maybe this isn't the main plot, but we'll do subplot 2. Maybe this isn't the main plot, but this is like another plot you've got going on in your novel. I will use this to track all the little subplots going on. So that way my plot column doesn't get overwhelmed and I can track each little thing individually. This really helps me keep things separate. It helps me look at pacing, and it helps me look how the subplots interact with each other and how they end up going all the way to the end and tying them together in a neat little bow. Then we move on to kingdoms and societies. So I will put, I say kingdoms just because I'm used to writing a kingdom with Project Lily. But you can go country. So you can have multiple, maybe you have 5 countries. I make a column for everyone. This helps me track what are they doing in each novel, or does another character mention them or have something to do with them? I'll put that in there. And then also, this also depends, how you set up your world. Maybe if there's different societies instead of countries, like different races or something like that, you can also put different society or a different race. I like tracking all these just because if it's 2 kind of individual units dealing with each other in whatever way, then it's really important to track how that happens throughout the novel. Think about a fantasy book where you have like fae, witches, humans, how do they all interact with each other? And having so many different like groups of people, it can be really hard to track, especially if you have a lot. So kind of putting them all out on the plot grid really helps organize everything and keep track of what I need to keep track of. Now the next two columns I will put in my plot grid, but I will not use these until I first read draft 1 and then start working on draft 2. These are things I like to track after the first draft, and it's really helpful to have these things, but I can't really have them until the first draft is done. The first is word count. I think keeping track of your word counts for every chapter is so important. It helps in terms of seeing how long chapters are. Like maybe this chapter is a little too long, maybe it's a little too short. Maybe I have 3 5,000 word chapters, one right after the other, and that's too many. I need to break it up. Also, when I get into revisions, if I have a high word count and I'm looking to chop words, it's much easier to chop words from a 5,000 word chapter than a 1,000 word chapter. And this will help me see where I can do that a lot more easily. So I keep track of this after the first draft, and I do use it a lot. You know, once the first draft is done, I won't be using this column before I start writing, but I like to have it for when I do. And the next is things to fix. So many times I have tried to create lists of things to fix, or I make a mental note like, okay, let me remember to fix this. And I don't remember, and I lose my list, or I forget I had a list, or I don't remember where I put it. And the things to fix just kind of floats out into the ether. I have started putting a things to fix column in there, and it really helps. Again, I won't do this for the first draft because the first draft is just like, get the story out. And there's going to be tons of things to fix. But as I go through the second and third drafts, I like to have this column. So if there's something that I can't quite figure out on the spot, or as I'm going through and reading a draft, and I'm like, ooh, this looks kind of weird, I can put a note in this column that this is something I need to fix. And that way, everything I need to fix is already laid out chapter by chapter. And I just like having everything all in one place. You don't have to put this in your plot grid if you don't want to, but I like having things in one place as much as possible just because it reduces the going through documents and going through papers, which I have done, and it's not fun. And that's essentially my plot grid. I'm going to zoom out so you can see it a little better, and it's maybe hard to read, but as you can see, I have a lot. I have up to W columns in this, and it's very large, and it goes all the way down to 40. Now, I like to look at this. I'm going to look over here because this is where my big monitor is. I like to use this on a big monitor. It just helps me see more things. And you can also blow it up a little bit if you have trouble reading these small prints, but I'm doing it on this because this is what I'm recording on. And then all I do after this is I start formatting. And I'm not going to go through and format this whole thing just because it might take quite a bit of time, but I'll format these. What I do like to do is freeze these. I can't remember where the freeze is. Page layout. No. View. Here it is, freeze panes. Freeze pane. Okay, that didn't work. I'm just gonna freeze the top row for now because I have to Google it and I'm not gonna do that right now. But I usually freeze column A and I freeze row 1. And that way when I'm scrolling through, those will always be there, super helpful. And then I start formatting. I'm just gonna do a few formats because you can do whatever you want. I do like to have this bold and centered. Makes it a little bit pretty. And then I will end up for this whole document wrapping text because the plot will get really long. So I'll just format a few of these. I like to do some colors, various colors. I like for my kind of administrative stuff to be gray. Setting, that makes me think of the earth. So I'm going to do green. Plot, make it blue. Oops, I did the wrong thing. We're gonna make this blue. And then for my characters, we'll make them pink. Relationship, we'll make that. I need to find a better purple. I can't do a super dark color like that. You know, I just go through and do this. And The colors also help because I associate certain colors with certain things. And so if I'm just trying to find it in this like 20 column spreadsheet, it helps me find it more easily. And it also helps me kind of keep things separate. So you can format this however you want. It's really up to you and what helps you do it. And that's my plot grid. And of course, you fill that out to your heart's content, however detailed you want to fill it out. And basically what I look for in a plot grid is, are there a lot of empty spaces with something? So if I'm tracking a character's arc, for example, are there 5 chapters where nothing happens emotionally or mentally for this character? Or is the plot really weak? Like maybe there's 1 sentence and every other chapter has like 10 sentences for plot. Those are the kinds of things I look for as I'm filling out my plot grid. And really, this is just to organize my thoughts, put everything on paper. So once it's time to start writing the book, I just fill it out until I feel that it's complete and I'm ready to write my book. And how I use this when I write is I will pull it up and I will look at, let's just say I'm going to write chapter 1. I will read every column in chapter 1 and I will formulate in my head, okay, all these things are going to happen. This is what needs to be said. I will kind of run through the chapter in my head before I start writing, and then I sit down to write. And what I also do when I finish writing a chapter is I update the plot grid. If I added a conversation, if I mentioned something important, or I added an event to a chapter as I was writing, I add it into the plot grid. This is very much a living document as I write my book. And the reason I do it this way is because when I need to go back and fix something, I am not going to scroll through 200 pages trying to find where did that happen. I have it all in my plot grid. It's updated as I write. And if I'm like, okay, I need to go back and revisit this scene, and of course, I'm not going to remember what chapter it was in, I can easily find it in my plot grid and then go back to that chapter in my document. And there you have it. I really love plot grids. I can't preach about them enough. I think they're an amazing tool for writers. And I really hope you give it a try. Even if you end up not using it, it's really fun to make. And maybe you'll learn something just in the process of making it. If you use plot grids or you give this a try and you really like it, please comment and let me know. I really hope you got a lot from this video and that this helps you in your writing journey.